I have a very special guest with me today. His name is Nash, and he's somebody that I met in the equity classes that I've been taking, that I've been mentioning on previous podcast episodes before. And I'm very excited to talk to you today, Nash, because you seem to have a very good grasp on historically how we got to today from a perspective of equity, but also the commercial statutory jurisdiction and how sometimes we can find ourselves entangled in that. And then one of the things that you do through your website, CrowsFoot.Info, is you help people move from that sort of status quo into the private. And a lot of people don't even know that there is a private realm where we can engage with each other without the oversight of Big Brother and without the state getting in between us. So I think one of the most obvious ones that I've started to learn more about is like with a marriage license. We all just are conditioned to go down and get a license, but what we're doing is we're inviting the state in between a spiritual relationship, and that gives the state, jurisdiction to say that we can do this, that, or whatever. And so the reason why I think this is going to be such a powerful call is because we are dealing with so many things, from taxes to um, license and travel restrictions and those kind of things, that are commercial in nature. And most people, I don't think, yet understand that we actually have private rights that supersede and have authority over these statutory this statutory jurisdiction. So, first and foremost, thank you for joining me today, Nash. I think we're going to have an incredible call, but welcome to the call.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
I'm excited, man. So, we have a little time to dive into all this. I think it'll be helpful for the listener to understand how we got here. Um, you shared some things with me the other day on the phone offline that was so fascinating to me, about the origin of equity, and I'm referring kind of to the I guess the English courts. You had mentioned that it had gone all the way back to Aristotle, Plato, and things of that nature. Can you explain to the listener where equity came from so that we have a broad understanding of what we're even talking about? And then we'll get into practical applications and how people can actually use this today to benefit themselves.
Sure, I'll take my best stab at it. I would say that in order to get some understanding of what equity is, certainly going back to Aristotle and studying his works and some of the works of Plato also would help to shed some light on the subject of equity. Equity, even in Aristotle's term, we're talking 384 BC or thereafter, um, was that equity was this sort of a remedy or remedial way of dealing with rules or regulations or law forms that are too rigid. And so equity finds a way to navigate around certain things that are inflexible. And so that would be kind of the earliest kind of known writings about equity to my knowledge. So the Greek philosophers, but primarily Plato and most likely Aristotle was a good place to start.
Hmm.
Now that philosophical sort of understanding or study of law, or what is the essence of law, is known as jurisprudence, probably sometimes later. However, this philosophy of law obviously stretched from the Greeks to the Romans, made its way through Egypt, and likely was known by many, not just Aristotle, I would assume. But as the development of law and society moves forward over time, we find that in and around, William the Conqueror goes into England. This is around 1066. And from that point, you start seeing this movement of land rights coming up again and again in the early common law courts of England. And then when the Crusades get underway, You have the military order of the Templars, the Hospitallers, the Teutonic Knights, and many others. But those are some of the main ones. And they were, in my opinion, were incentivized by trust law to be able to move and then come back and retain their land rights on these crusades. And so it really has a lot to do with land rights, and trust law is how equity became such a such a pronounced part of our common day court system. Um, yeah,
The way that I think about it, and give me your feedback on this, is the difference between the letter of the law and the spirit of the law. As a crude example, if somebody was speeding in today's modern world, if they were speeding down the highway at 90 miles an hour, the letter of the law says that you've broken the speed limit. But when you find out that maybe there was a pregnant woman in the car and they were rushing to the hospital, the spirit of the law the equity would say, hey, there was a reason behind it that sort of supersedes the standard everyday regulation that we're trying to keep people in, and that therefore equity would therefore prevail. Is that's maybe a crude example, but is that accurate?
sure. The idea is that law enforcement at any time can use their consciousness, okay, and give remedy or allow for some flexibility if if it's if it's needed, and very often it is. And so that's why, in the jurisdiction of land, we used to have peace officers. They weren't there necessarily to be policy enforcement, which is more rigid. And that's a rabbit hole in of itself. But that they and policy enforcers, police officers, they can also offer a more flexible decision-making process on the side of the road or what have you. But you're right when you hammer down on the spirit and intent of the law is really an equitable principle. It's jurisprudence, again, which is the coming to understanding and construction of law, but also that requires some remedy. The letter of the law, as you mentioned, would be in our country mostly recognized through our history as the common law. And
Mm-hmm.
not to bash common law, because when you really get into looking at what common law is, or what I like to call venerable common law, you really see that it is a bottom up working between various matters, cases, and precedent from people, people working out their differences from a bottom up manner. And there's a lot to be said for that letter of the law. However, in many cases, you know, the man's life and the way that man experiences life and the different situation that man will find himself or herself in is infinite. And so to think that we have this letter of the law that everything's going to fit in a box is rather ridiculous.
Yeah, it makes me
So,
think of the IRS code and the thousands and thousands of pages. They keep adding layer after layer after layer because there's a new circumstance or a new technology or a new relationship that they have to have a rule around. So you can see how convoluted it can get very relatively quickly.
yes. So you've aptly stated, um, equity is a remedial sort of law form. Um, it seeks remedy. It doesn't seek to necessarily pay money, uh, monetary damages, although in this day and age it has changed that has been now brought into some of the equity procedures. But for most of its history, that was not an aspect of equity. It was mostly there to find a fair outcome to a certain matter, in spite of that letter of the law or in spite of the common law very often. Something that doesn't line up exactly with statute or code, especially, and or just, a law that was not flexible enough for someone, for many, many different matters. So, yes, again, that's a good one. I would suspect that if I was a peace officer or a trooper and I pulled someone over who was speeding and they were about to have a baby, that you would allow them to maybe move on.
Hmm.
However, you might ask them to slow down just a bit so they actually make it to the hospital. So these are all sorts of conversations you would have in the moment, and equity works in personam. So it is up to the officer at that time, the people in the car to engage in personam, from person to person, and figure out what's going on, and let's do the right thing. That's effectively what equity wants to
So,
do. It's about the spirit and intention of the law.
it's my understanding that way back when, you had a king that would basically tell everybody this is what you need to do and how you need to do it. And in essence, it provided the king the ability to give agency to the people so that they weren't coming back to the king and having him be a bottleneck for every little decision that needed to be made, but maybe more importantly that he wouldn't necessarily have to hold people to the letter of the law, and therefore when it was unjust have them rebel and take his head off. Was that is there some element of truth in that, as to the origin of equity?
Yes, to my research anyway, what I see there is that is you're talking to the development of the courts of chancery, really. So during the divine right of kings, the king had the ability, by the king's conscience, to hear certain oh um, oh hear certain cases or people who would be petitioning the king's court because they felt like some rule was too rigid or didn't apply to them or was unfair in some way. You could, you could petition the king. And from, what history lays out is that it loosely looks something like the king would hold court, hear petitions, maybe, maybe adjudicate something in a more fair way or give someone remedy. Um, this begins to develop over time, and I think the King's Court gets maybe overpopulated. The king then assigns a chancellor. The chancellor is to be the conscience of the king. So now the king is sort of subcontracted out his consciousness to deal with, you know, a steady, um, a steady line of petitions at the
Hmm.
King's Court. And so then from the King's Court, it, roughly turns into the Court of Chancery or Chancery Court. And so then it's being held by, the Chancellor is now hearing these petitions and attempting to give remedy based on what he generally believes the king's conscience would be. And if
Hmm.
the king was to be acting in a way that was lacking conscionability, it would be that the chancellor would be there to act in a conscionable way. Um, so that's very interesting. It's still two fallible men or one fallible man making conscious decisions to give remedy, but at least they're trying. Um, but in that, in as we move forward in history through the chancery courts, that is roughly the story, and it develops beyond that point, of course, too. Um, but something to know is that all of equity is based on conscionability. It's not this DEI thing that you hear about today. We're talking about honor, uh, an honorable individual acting with a high level of conscionability. And you'll find that through all of trust law. And the basis of equity is that it's about conscionability first.
Well, that begs a question, what is conscionable and what is the right thing to do and who determines what's right and what isn't right? Um, you and I have had conversation around even the biblical foundation to some of this stuff, and not to make this a conversation about religion, but this is so clearly a derivative of biblical doctrine that you can see that there is a connection between the good book and basically how our society functions even to today, and how these things have essentially divine authority because it is right, it is righteous. If you believe, like I do, that there is a righteous creator, there is always a divine principle to fall back on that is equitable, that is right. Hey, this is what's just. Um, so it's interesting. Give us a sense of historically the chancery courts were around what time? When was this developing?
Well, the king would hold court is the earliest point here. And so if you look at William the Conqueror does his bit in England in 1066, from that time, from 1066 all the way, continues to develop and argue with the common law courts um, for some time. And this goes on all the way up to the, American Revolution.
Hmm.
So it's a long bit of time there.
Hmm.
But after the I say around 1300, it really starts to have its uh, its beingness in the courts. So the Chancery Court becomes very well recognized by, late 1100 to 1200. Um, and then moving forward, the Chancery Court is just an aspect of, English law in that time.
So, okay, so I'm gonna just, if there was a time where the king was taking court and creating outcomes, and then that can become too overwhelming, so he started to essentially delegate out his consciousness to the chancery. The chancery then starts
Hmm.
trying to try cases, et cetera, doing the best he can to act upon what he thinks the king would do. I could see how that would be very, and yeah, very flawed. But I would imagine then that over time they could start to recognize certain patterns, certain principles, and say, okay, well, let's start to bake these into how to handle these matters. And so I could see how it would mature at that standpoint. Is that roughly accurate?
Yeah, I'd say that's roughly accurate. I mean, I teach classes on some of this stuff, and without going into too much of a deep dive, that's following along pretty good, the time frame there. So yeah, around 1100 to 1200, you see the Chancery Court develop because of this need for remedy. I do believe there was some other interest there from the crown to keep equity around, though, as well. So it's not, while we look at it now as this remedy that is for us to use, it was mishandled a number of times, I would say. And I
Mm.
don't have exact factual basis for this, but if you look at some of the way equity was used in certain cases, you could argue that, well, it maybe wasn't so fair. That aside, it's still a remedial law form. And all good intentions, can often go the wrong way. But I think equity has always been a remedial form, primarily for the common law. Um, and in situations where land is involved, certainly the crown was interested in having that land. So were they always using the chancery courts for the benefit of the petitioners or the people? I think depending on who the king is
Hmm.
at a certain time. you could say maybe not so much, but it did continue to develop, and it is very intertwined with trust law.
Share how you told me in a previous conversation about how the soldiers were sent off to war, but they wanted to make sure that they had their land when they came back. Can you walk us through historically what happened there?
Well, you have knights. Very often were lords and barons, and they would very often be granted or granted land. So they were free land holders, would have been the term, and or they would have had land on free hold. Okay, and so this was during a feudal age, a feudal system. And so once you have this situation with the Crusades take off, well, what's the incentive to leave your land? I mean, the possibility of traveling many, many miles to go be in a war was not a great it was a high possibility you weren't going to make it back. And so what is the incentive there? Now, this is just my own research and opinion here.
Hmm.
But if you have given someone incentive that they will be a free landholder or they will have their land on freehold upon return of this mission on the Crusades, well, that might be an incentive for many to up their status in this feudal system. And so I think there's a lot of this trust law was developed because of this. The common law did not recognize this trust law situation. They operated more on bilateral contracts, a contract between this person and this person here. Whereas a trust is a unilateral setup in most every case. You have a singular grantor who decides to convey some amount of value to a trustee or a steward in those days to hold said land for a third party, which is the beneficiary. And in equity, the beneficiary is always the equitable owner of said land. Now, they would do this and they would set this up. And the common law said, well, if you give up your land and you go away, effectively, we're not going to honor this idea of you coming back and reclaiming your land if you're gone for who knows how many years. Didn't exist. So there was this term, the use, which later gets called trust law, but it was the use was developed. And this came out of a need, in my opinion, to incentivize lords, barons, knights to go on these crusades and come back and have their land. And so I think that was a very, very big early development of trust law. And the reason why that's so important is because you could imagine the kind of conflicts that went on between the two courts. You would have the common law court that did not recognize this use, and the chancery court would very often override the common law. And they were the first to form. The chancery court is the court that formed the injunction, which is an equitable remedy. So if the common law said, no, we're not going to recognize this use, the chancery court could step in, override with an injunction, and, you know, adjudicate it a different way.
Hmm.
So you could see in that case where this could be confusing, and it was for a long time. They fought back and forth, the common law and the chancery courts until, all the way up until basically Sir Francis Bacon, who was Attorney General at that time. And I believe it was, don't quote me here, but I think it was 1566. But you can double check on that one. But he basically did a study if Chancery Court should continue, and the common law courts had tried to um, take the Chancery Court out for a long time. So this went on. It was a feud. And if you want to read Bleak House by Charles Dickens, he captures this part in history where this fight between the common law and the chancery courts goes on for generations.
Hmm.
So you may have a father who has a matter that's being heard in the common law, and he's fighting back and forth between the two courts for generations. Very interesting book, but it's not it's not a happy tale. But Bleak House goes into depth on what happened in this point in English law in history where there was very much some bleak households and some rough times where people suffered through several generations of a singular case because of
Hmm.
this.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know. I'm kind of hopefully that answers some of what you wanted to know there. But trust law and equity are combined at the hip. There would be no trust law without equity, um, and the development and the use of equity in the way that we use it now and have been using it definitely was set in motion by the use and later trust law and the acknowledgement of trust law finally by the common law court. And then this so-called fusion of the common law and the chancery court later. And that's in the Judicature Acts of 1735,
Mm.
1738, where they try to mix these two jurisdictions. In my opinion, that's like mixing oil and water. They just
Mm-hmm.
really don't mix. However, there was some adopting of opposing rules between the common law court and the chancery court.
Mm. Fascinating. All right. Well, that um, leads us all the way up almost to the Revolutionary War. So, what was the conflict? I know common law was something that the founding fathers strongly um, um, used and wanted. Obviously wrote the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution. They talked a lot about nature's law, God's law in the Federalist Papers. So, can you give the listener a um, glimpse into what the thinking was at that time and how that opposed the British rule at the time? And so let's just, yeah, let's pause here at the Revolutionary War so we get a better understanding of that conflict.
Well, you know, you had the Continental Congress. So there's actually 14 US presidents prior to George Washington. A lot of people don't know that. They weren't the type of presidency that existed after Washington, of course, but they were there. They had shorter terms. And then you have the Articles of Confederation. And then you have later, beyond that, we still have treaties that are developed. Um, so, in regard to equity, at that time, equity just kind of hopped the pond. It didn't really change much. The common law courts, they were directly the same all the way until the Declaration of Independence. Now, after the Declaration of Independence, um, and I would say right there with the Articles of Confederation, we now have the king's consciousness. We, the people, are now the conscious, it is on us. We are now incumbent to use jurisprudence, to use equity. We are endowed with the king's conscience. Um,
Hmm. Which was a radical, radical thing. First time in history that's ever happened, correct?
yeah, and the only time that
Yep.
I know.
Yep.
Um, and so you can see what kind of trouble that's going to cause for, world powers. You've got this new experiment where all these people now have individually, each one of them have the same right as any king. We weren't to have subjects, but we were to have a the full extent of freedom. So in that way, when equity makes it to America, there's no longer the conscience of the king or the chancellor, but by we the people.
Mm. That's a
And
big
this
responsibility.
Well, yeah, it gets confused and watered down and misunderstood when you start to look at the Civil War and the changes thereafter. But from that time, from the American Revolution up to the Civil War, we did a pretty good job of being a Republican form of government, and it has nothing to do with the Republican Party, which is a private member association, by the way, as well as the Democratic Party. Um, Basically, two fraternities that operate in a private jurisdiction. Okay. Um, but what the Republic was prior to that, you had peace officers. You had a union of states, a federation of states, which still stand today. Many people don't maybe understand that. And we had a confederation of states, which constructed or was the 365-day a year governing we the people government. That was our Republican form of government, the confederation of states, not the confederacy. No, the Confederation of States was our Republican form of government by we the people. That Confederation of States constructed what we now call the federal government with one purpose in mind, and that purpose was for trade and commerce. I shouldn't even say trade, but yeah, commerce, commercial involvement on the high seas and the inland waterways. A lot of people
So
say, "What happened to our government?" And I tell them they're doing exactly what they were set up to do, the federal government.
yes, okay. So the Confederation of States, again, not to be confused with the Confederates, the
Correct.
slave holding. Okay, so the Confederation of States was basically the states coming together saying, "Hey, it'd be nice if we had one body to help facilitate commercial trade over the seas." Is
Yes.
that correct? So they
Yes.
therefore then created the federal government, a new level of jurisdiction to basically oversee the commercial waterways that ships the shipping of goods back and forth between Europe and Africa and America.
Yes, this is an oversimplification, of course, and there's a lot more to
Right.
be kind of sussed out in this conversation. But if your listeners are interested, it's out there and there's it's deep and wide. But yeah, I mean, the jurisdictions had already existed. You know, law is land, air, and water. So you have
L A
jurisdiction of the
W.
land. That
Sorry,
yes,
just to specify, the
no problem.
law LAW is an acronym for land, air, water. These different levels of
Yes.
jurisdiction of governance.
Hmm.
Okay, sorry, go ahead.
And so our Republican form of government is exists on the land, jurisdiction of the land, both literally and figuratively. The jurisdiction of the air is just that, literal and figuratively. When you go into trust law, it's the intention, such as the mind. It's in the air. Water is where man of from time immemorial has been shipping, um, moving goods and services across body of water. So the jurisdiction of the water it was already an international jurisdiction recognized by, pretty much everyone in the world.
Hmm.
Okay. So at that time, we already had commerce on the high seas, but people think that the revolution was just like we kicked the British out of the country, et cetera, et cetera. That's not all true. The treaties really settled the deal. And in those treaties, the British, by the signing of our Constitution, which in my opinion is a subcontract to the British government, so they may offer governmental services. And
Explain
that's
what you
what
mean
they've
by
been.
that. That's fascinating.
Hmm.
Expand that out a little bit.
Well, if you were Britain and you wanted to keep some kind of, hold on this new America. They you got to throw them a bone if you're going to sign a treaty. And what that turned out to be was, allowing them to offer governmental services. And they allowed them to effectively have their jurisdiction of the water on the high seas, inland waterways in the United States. That was granted from the treaties at the end of the Revolutionary War. So they were allowed to offer governmental services. You might say, well, what does that mean? Well, if you're in the jurisdiction of the land, you have a republican form of government, you have peace officers, you have free landholders, you have people, farmers, you know, people going about their lives on the land. Well, if the British want to offer you some sort of contract or some sort of, whatever it may be, they have the free right to contract with you. Um, and so, there's 8 elements of a true contract, and you might want to make sure you understand completely what they're offering. But that, but in reality, they were allowed to offer governmental services. It's a very interesting thing. So if you're looking at, Article 3 of the Constitution, you can find more about this subject. But so that was set up after the treaties of the Revolutionary War. And then on the advent of the federal government, prior to, the Civil War, which I think led to the Civil War, was the construction of this federal government, which was supposed to be a Republican form of government. We, the people, operating in and with commerce on the high seas and inland waterways. And this is where this argument starts.
Mm.
Everyone goes to slavery and this and that. I still do not believe that that is the case. And
What do
if
you
you
mean?
look at, well, I mean, the popular idea about the Civil War is that was all about slavery, and that's really not really capturing, I think, what went on there. But maybe point of discussion for another time. But this competition between still the British. Remember, we had the War of 1812. Then we got the Mexican American War. We've got all kinds of wars going on this whole time, from the Revolutionary War all the way, into and beyond, of course, the Civil War. But I would say that the Civil War was a second American Revolution. And if you want to go deeper than that, you might say, why do we call it a revolution? Because it's cyclical, and it almost sounds like there's a manual to this sort of thing.
Mm. Yeah, it's so fascinating when you start to look at the meaning of words and the implications. We all were taught about the Civil War and what is that's a frame. It's a psychological frame that suggests that that it's a war between the civilians and that it was the North versus the South. But that's a some could argue that's a propagandist perspective. Like we're gonna teach that this was a civil war against these people when maybe there was some other realms outside of that you're alluding to anyway. Can you give me just we could probably have a whole nother podcast and maybe I'll have you back on to talk about it. But what is if it wasn't about slavery, what do you think it was about?
Well, I think it was mostly about control. And some of that has to do with the control of the high seas and those inland waterways that were agreed upon in the treaties. And then you have the Confederation of States kind of come apart, where you've got the northern states and the southern states not able to work things out. Why is that, though? Did that happen from insider proxies? Did it happen, inside Congress? How exactly did that come apart that way? And there's some more popular narratives out there, and then there's some more kind of hard research that would bear out something other than what we've been taught in school,
Hmm.
so to speak. So, but without going too far down there, I think it has a lot to do with commerce, and it has a
Hmm.
lot to do with being able to offer those governmental services. Um, so, but we don't need to get too far. The Civil War is a huge conversation
Yeah.
in of itself, and I would suggest that it's not a civil war. It was labeled a civil war. What is civil? We're talking about Roman civil society. We're talking about the ecclesia. You have a lot of other things that come in and sort of color our of what the Civil War was. So I would urge people to go out and maybe dive a little deeper into who, what, or why would a power want to have more control and start looking through that set of lenses.
Do you have is there a particular resource, a book or something that someone you could point somebody to so that we don't have to go down the rabbit hole, but at least give somebody something to, to bite off and chew?
Um, well, there's a number of books out there. One of my teachers by the name of Robert William on American Meaning Group does a phenomenal job of citing resources as well as talking about sacred honor. And I would suggest to maybe go check out the archives of American Meeting Group .com, and you're going to find a ton of speakers there on this subject from Robert himself, as well as there's others that people may know. Anna von Reitz, she has a phenomenal understanding of history and has brought a lot of this heavy lifting forward. But there's many other authors out there on. There's just tons of subjects on tons of books on the subject of the Civil War. But I would say as a go-to to get started and understanding this, there's also there's the Avalon Project, Yale University, and you can go there and look in their archives, and you can start looking at the hard documents yourself, the treaties, the ordinances, and this goes from the old world England forward. There is just tons of stuff there. The Avalon Project, Yale University is probably the place I would go if you think you really want to research some of the stuff and put the chain links together. I would say
Hmm.
that would be the strongest starting point. But then certainly checking out AMG and a lot of the presenters there.
Okay. I'd love to maybe have you back on too so that we can go into that because I'm fascinated by that as well. But moving forward, so you talked about there was a pivot point, and I think it was the 14th Amendment around that time, just after the Civil War. Is that I think I'm getting the
Mhm.
timeline correct? What happened there, and how is that affecting us today?
Well, I mean, there's the 14th Amendment, and that's one piece of the puzzle here. But right around that same time, which I think is maybe as important, is the federal rules of civil procedure. There's that word civil again, and it's an overlay over our venerable common law. Um, Now beginning to create precedent. So if you look at law, you'll know that in America, and like England, common law is the foundation. Um, then you have the courts of chancery later fusing together. So now you have common law and equity together, and um, then you have customs. And then from customs, you have this rules of civil procedure, which really kind of rapidly wraps things up quickly to be adjudicated rather quickly, maybe too quickly, in my opinion, putting everything based on codes and statutes, swiftly adjudicating matters and, based on precedent where judges are not acting as much as sort of a jurisprudence kind of position where they're divining how to give remedy to a matter or find a solution as much as they are more or less referees based on these civil rules.
Hmm.
And in Europe, you'll see that civil law, many of the European countries are directly under civil law. Um, Civil law is roughly it's Roman law. It comes from Caesar. And it's a very different way of adjudicating matters, whereas the common law was always solution oriented. It's a remedial base, and it was between the common man and woman to escalate their situations upward to be understood and mediated at best and adjudicated in a proper manner, at least. Um, So you once we have this federal rules of civil procedure, you start to see, in my opinion, a misuse of equity again as the federal government expands after the Civil War. Everything's being adjudicated in uh, commercially in the jurisdiction of the water.
Even though it's on land
Hmm.
and dealing.
Because there's
So
and that's the important aspect of the Civil War is that the Confederation of States adjourns and has not been back into session for, I don't know, 165 years, give or
mhm.
take. And because of that, the only government that was left standing that operates 365 days a year was the previously rather newly constructed federal government. And they were constructed for what purpose? Commerce.
Okay, so this is
And that's what they have been doing the entire time.
this is where things get very, very interesting because what gets essentially thrown out, at least in terms of practical application, is the more fundamental equitable common law that the country was really intentionally designed to instill. And now we have this enveloping of the commercial law from the federal um, standpoint that essentially entangles the entire these are my words, my opinion, entangles the entire country in statutory relationship. And then that is, and because these are all water terms, um, or I should say that this is a water jurisdiction, you will find that there are water terms all around our entire existence, which again, this goes down a rabbit hole, but to me, this is so fascinating. I've shared it before a little bit on the podcast, but you start to, when you bring awareness to this and you start to realize that there's all these water terms around our birth. Birth itself is a portion of a ship. You go down when you're born, you go down your mother's birth canal. Her water breaks. You are connected to her from your navel. There is a doctor. There's a birth certificate. These are all shipping terms. These are all water terms. And so it begs the question, like, is this some type of um, devious plot to get us to entangle ourselves in commerce when really we have a fundamental spiritual, equitable rights given to us by God that does supersede and have authority over these commercial entanglements. What's your take on that?
Well, I think you're spot on. Uh, uh, a dock tender was later how you come up with a doctor. So you're right. You come through the birth canal. It's also about energy, circuit courts. You get charged. It goes on and on. You can't really make
Currency.
this stuff up. If it, Yeah, so exactly. And there's also current and sea. Okay, so there's a lot of wordplay here. I think a lot of people, especially today, are reaching out and looking to find how we've been duped, how we've been, misled, all of these things. I personally believe that's a bit of a dangerous chase. Um,
Why?
and that goes into, well, I think that we're getting into sacred honor, whereas if you look at your life and you honor who you are. It's never too late to have a happy childhood. It's
How do you
never
mean?
too late
What do you
to
mean by that?
find remedy. I mean, if you've looked back into life and you felt that you've been duped, misled, this is going to bring up a lot of anger. And we've heard the term patriot warfare. You know, you don't want to end up on a naughty list for rattling pitchforks and rifles and the like.
Sorry, how does that
And I
relate
don't
to
think it,
one's upbringing though? Like, I'm not sure I'm following.
well, because it's quite a shock once you realize this language is knocking on the door of colorable law, fictional authority. Your birth
Explain.
certificate can, yeah, okay, well, where we were just at, you were talking about you were born through the birth canal, all these relations to water, commerce, commercial, admiralty, maritime law,
Hmm.
international maritime law. Well, it works on color of law. So the land jurisdiction is lawful and commerce is legal. Legal is the undoing of lawful. It's a mirroring of lawful. So it's a fiction. Some people would call it the straw man. I don't really particularly like that term, but your social security number that's been applied to you like a tag in a cow's ear, that belongs to the commercial statutory world. And it's fictional by nature. But if you start telling people, the reality about taxes and taxes being voluntary and so much of their lives have been spent indoctrinated and in a certain understanding, and you start bringing these things forward, most people get either really upset, really scared, or really sad. And it's a very deep spiritual shock that occurs when you realize you have been mistaken, and
Hmm.
maybe for most of your lifetime. So, I guess what I'm touching at there is that you see this awakening happening as we become aware of this commercial overlay. And is it a nefarious manual to do this to us, to keep us suppressed, to keep us oppressed, right? Is that why they're utilizing this commerce jurisdiction of the water or, admiralty maritime law in this way? And I would suggest that no, not directly. However, there has been indoctrination on such a deep level that many who should know no longer know the riddle. They don't understand the riddle. Um, so you touched on some stuff there about jurisdiction of the water. And after the Confederation of States adjourned and didn't come back to session, the creation of the federal government continues on adjudicating matters in the jurisdiction of commerce, and then later applies a social security number to you. Now you're considered a company, a taxpayer, an asset, your chattel. And that's what I'm touching on because many out there are upset as they come to this awareness that they thought they were just a common man or woman by nature with the ability to own land freely. And they find out the hard way that that's not the case. Or if it is the case, there is a lot of compelling of performance and a lot of law to dig through and a lot of cognitive dissonance going on there. And some people just give up flat out.
Hmm.
So I guess where I went with that when you started talking about jurisdiction of the water is just that once you start to unravel this, it can bring about well, it's already brought about an entire movement of individuals that are may have some violent interests here. They start thinking in a revolutionary sort of way, and that's dangerous, I think,
I
is what I'm getting at.
I think so too, and that is certainly not the intention of bringing this stuff to awareness. And I have
No,
fundamentally found that when you see it for what it is and you remove emotion, which I know is can be very, very difficult, but if you accept it as it is and you recognize that, okay, these are just simply two different jurisdictions of governance. One says you do things this way, another one says you can do things this way. Um, when you recognize that in they aren't necessarily in conflict because one does supersede the other, you just simply step into the one that supersedes the other. And one of the things that I've loved about the mentor that you and I both share is that he often is saying that we're not in conflict. We're not here to be against you. I'm not arguing against you. I'm simply here to bring forth my rights. And when you know how to communicate, A, when you know what the rights are, and then B, you know how to communicate them and hold your ground when stress tested, because they sometimes will stress test you, even if it's not a nefarious intention. It could just simply be, what are you talking about? This is not what I'm used to. There could be some seeming conflict, but when you just realize it's communication, and that you're not in conflict, I have been finding that does seem to alleviate and provide the remedy that I'm seeking. I know other people that are trying to do this and they get very frustrated and very angry and they are in conflict. And that energy seems to always find opposition. And so they're constantly, in a, it's like two deers with an antler lock. They're constantly locked
sure.
in conflict. When to me it's a intellectual. If I'm in conflict, I'm missing something. Is how I think about it. What am I missing? And oftentimes it's just the energy that I'm bringing to it. Um, that you don't have to be in conflict, that you can bring equitable righteousness to a situation. And oftentimes I think about it in terms of bringing equitable righteousness to the person that I'm seemingly in conflict with. Like maybe they're not aware of this. Maybe they don't know the history that you've been talking about. Maybe they don't understand that we all have these rights. This starts to segue into sacred honor. I'd love for you to explain what that is and frankly really what you're all about because this is speaks to the heart of I think what you do and how you help people with um, navigating this whole arena.
Sure. So there are many, likely over 1,800 equitable maxims. What's an equitable maxim? You probably know some off the top of your head, but one is equity will not aid a volunteer. Another one is equity aids the vigilant. Um, if you bring equity, you must bring or come with clean hands. It's not word for word what that maxim is, but a maxim of law is also what you heard me say earlier about venerable common law. Venerable is similar to maxim as a word, where it is recognized as settled, as a law form, as a maxim in time immemorial. Everyone believes and agrees upon these maxims as settled and understood throughout history. Okay. So if you have somewhere around 1,800 maxims of equity, and there's more, and I would suggest that you could probably develop more as we change, as we move forward here into the future, but that these equitable maxims are the guide rails for recognizing if you are or are not in honor. Sacred honor, the sacred honor I'm speaking to, and friends, colleagues, teachers of mine refer to going back to the Declaration of Independence, where our founding fathers pledged their sacred honor to each other. What is a sacred honor? It comes from natural law. And from natural law, we come to Well, from natural law, we come to all of our philosophical greats and eventually come to what I would suggest is common law. Our common law is really an amazing law form. And we won't go into that just now, but the reality is that the equitable maxims are how you define what is honorable. Most people just think it's an opinion. No. Um, so just do a quick Google search and you can find easily 20 to 50 of these equitable maxims. And I would suggest that almost everybody's going to find most of these maxims will resonate with what's already inside of them. In
Mm.
other words, it's not going to be foreign. It's not going to feel awkward because it's something you already know is innate.
Self-evident.
Yes. And so when we're talking about sacred honor, we're talking about the sacred usufruct, this use of the earth as it was gifted or granted, I should say, to us. And we are the beneficiaries of this trust arrangement, so to speak, under God.
Mm.
And to be a good steward is to practice sacred honor. And to practice sacred honor, in my opinion, especially at this day and age, would be to practice and understand American exclusive equity. So it's not just equity, there's concurrent equity, there's auxiliary equity, there's financial equity. Okay, there's a number of different equities.
And these
But
are just
Mhm.
essentially subsets of equity that is applies to a specific area of governance. Is that
Yes.
accurate?
So in say the courts of chancery and courts today, you have concurrent equity, which has been equitable cases and precedents that have been adjudicated in the past. And so much of what the early equity was has changed to being as measurable as a precedent or case law. Not quite the same. Exclusive equity excludes everything. So if I'm standing here in equity, everything outside of that is excluded. Now I'm talking about my self-governance, the equity that as it applies to me in an honorable fashion. That means that I am self-governing and I am using these equitable maxims to help guide me on my path in sacred honor.
Um,
Concurrent and auxiliary are more classifications of procedural equity throughout
okay.
history.
Okay. You said that there was 1,800 maximums of equity. What would you say are the broad stroke in layman's terms? What is I'm trying to draw a distinction in my mind between equity versus, say, common law. I had used those often as synonyms, and I'm a toddler in this. I'm probably more of a crawling baby actually in this entire world. So you're exposing all these different subsets and all these different distinctions that I'm unfamiliar with at this point. But you talked about nature's law, common law, equity, all these subsets of equity. Can you give us can you try to give us a macro level view of how these things why they exist and how they distinctively separate themselves from each other?
Well, it's case by case. I would suggest the easiest way to understand equity and to understand maxims of equity and maxims of law or common law, those exist as well. But these are things that have been well worn, and I mean it very literally when I say you are dealing with something that you read or you interact with in just an organic everyday life, and it's either awkward or off-putting or it is resonant with you. Okay. You're experiencing equity all the time in a way. You're experiencing jurisprudence, in my opinion, all the time. We don't really look at it like that. We don't walk around as lawyers. We're just walking around as common men and women. But we are constantly making decisions. We're constantly trying to discern what is right and wrong. So, in the most useful fashion, if you were to delve into, um, let's say you have special understanding of something, and you're going to go into a contract, and you know that this contract is going to pay out a value of some sort for you, and yet you don't disclose all the information in the contract. You do go into contract, the other person doesn't know. Well, you have now come with unclean hands. That's one of the doctrine. That's one of the maxims. You've deceived. We all
Hmm.
know that deception is wrong.
Hmm.
It's in the Bible, it's in scripture, it's everywhere. You know when you're deceiving someone, and that's just a very loose analogy there, but these maxims of equity help to remind you of of settled philosophical and lawful uh, paradigms. They're not, these maxims are paradigms, really, if you start to break them down. They catch wide swaths of mankind's um, endeavors
Hmm.
on this earth. And they are there as the backbone of the material, back to jurisprudence, that law is made from. Okay, so I don't know if I did any justice there in that answer, but
To me, it's like I'm circling this whole thing, and every time I
mhm.
go around, I'm getting a new, slightly um, more refined understanding of it. So, yeah, it's not something. I mean, I've been now in this realm for probably 2.5 years, and the more I know, the more I realize how massive all of this is. So it's going to take some time to be patient and let this stuff marinate a little bit before I really start to get it.
And as we said earlier, we're going back to, 384, 386, 390, Aristotle. I mean, and he didn't come to this stuff just on his own. He studied under Plato, um,
Hmm.
and other like-minded individuals. So equity has been around as long as that, at least.
Hmm.
At least in theory and at least in the philosophy. So mankind is far older than Aristotle. So, equity, you could say, shining a light back into the distant past has always been there. There's always been a way where God has his hand in something, changing the direction of things um, as needed, and has created a situation that is movable and living and so mutable.
Hmm.
So once you get into that, that's a more sacred honor, sort of more spiritual way of saying what jurisprudence and equity is attempting to do. And there was equitable giants like Joseph Story writes at one point, and I won't do him justice here in because I'm not quoting him directly, but effectively he says that the conscience of man is a measurable science. To me, that hit me as profound.
Hmm.
So this remedial sort of law, trying at the edge of your consciousness to define a remedy or a solution to something. We're talking high level problem solving and high level critical thinking,
Hmm.
is a measurable science. It's pretty profound. Whether it's true or not, I don't know. But when you get into equity and jurisprudence and we try to pinch down on something static, it's very difficult to do because it's it's remedial. It's
It's
always
living.
looking for another option. Yeah.
Hmm. So for those that are getting nauseous with all this philosophical and theoretical talk. Let's bring them back into this conversation and share why this stuff actually has potency in our practical world today. What are the benefits of understanding equity, or maybe as a shortcut, what are the benefits for somebody coming to you to have you help assist them in their modern, everyday, practical issues? Like maybe you can give a few examples of why equity matters and the benefits that we get in our practical modern living by understanding it today.
Okay, so my association handles writing private entities, uh, ministries, private member associations, and the like. I also write trusts, and we also offer trustee services. Um, we also deal to some extent in silver and managing estates. So what we do is to help people step away from all these contracts they've signed. They've acquiesced to a number of commercial obligations, many of them by mistake, and many of them maybe under color of law, duress, number of other things. But so what I help to do is to help people understand that they can rescission. So an equitable right is to rescission old contracts. Um, and so you can start to release some of this burden. And most of the time it is financial, but everyone out there knows that if your finances are tight, it makes things very difficult to move around and have the a certain quality of life if you're always stressed and pressed. And usually this means that you are tethered to previous contracts. Maybe it's the IRS, maybe it's old military contracts, maybe it's old marriages, or vehicles, all these things that are in this commercial world that we have contracted with tend to end up being this massive cobweb that keeps us exposed in the out there in public, and they are able to adjudicate certain things against you, charges against you, based on your prior contracts. So what we work to do is to set up robust structures to help start to make your business private, help people develop an understanding of these jurisdictions so that they can set up private associations, set up their ministries, set up new practices, and do it in a way where they are protected. It is both lawful and legal, and they start to reclaim their dominion, which is all the different jurisdictions we've mentioned here. And to do that in a private manner with limited exposure to that public commercial sort of matrix, if you will.
Hmm.
A big part of what we do is we work on private finance and how to truly understand how to develop your practical use of money, um, Federal Reserve notes out in the public, and how you can transition to a very private sort of financial stance, which can greatly minimize this exposure to commercial contracts. So that would probably be the quickest nutshell I could come up with. But in short, I write documents, notices, and assist people in becoming private again. They are already private, but most people have sort of extended themselves out so far into so many contracts that they wouldn't be able to satisfy these agreements by the time they pass away. And that's unfortunate, causes a lot of disharmony and stress in people's lives. And so we help them reel back their good name. They help them reel back their autograph, their signatures, bring them into the private, help them rescission by way of mutual mistakes that they made in the past, help get clean, help come to back to a place of clean hands, which is a sacred honor process of rescission, an equitable process, and then also find new avenues for being able to develop private contracts, private trusts, so that they can continue into the future without making the same sort of mess, if you will.
Hmm.
So private financial assistance, private trusts writing, private contracts, and an understanding of jurisdictions and all this. So I teach an immersive trust class, um, and I offer that at CrowsFoot.Info. There's a lot of good interviews there, and we do a lot more than just that. But we do offer trustee services, um, and we do write and produce trust in private entities.
Awesome. I've got a lot of follow-up questions to that so my first one is how or why or under what circumstance is rescissioning a contract equitable or honorable?
Okay. Well, one of the eight elements of a contract, when people talk about contracts, I think there's a lot of misunderstanding. When lawfully you're talking about a contract, there's only two, as we know them from English common law, and that is a simple contract or a special contract. So that's the fundamental two different kinds of contracts. Contracts are bilateral in nature, and um, one of the components for a contract to fail is if a corporation or a fictitious entity is in contract with a man or a woman. A man or a woman are, and there's a bunch of commercial terms attached to men and women, such as person, which again comes from the water, the purser, another ship. The purser was very often the one who handled money on a ship.
Hmm.
Um, and and then there's the individual, which is known to be a commercial term for taxpayer, believe it or
Hmm.
not. So men and women are not the same kind as a corporation. And many, sometimes under duress, other times just by mistake. So an equitable mistake, um, there's remedy there for an equitable mistake. If you went into a contract and you didn't have full, full consideration, and you didn't have full disclosure, and you signed, then that was a mistake most of the time. The other mistake is you think you're signing by way of autograph when actually you're signing with a signature. An autograph is land jurisdiction. A signature is commercial jurisdiction. One is lawful, an autograph. One is legal, which is commercial.
What
And so, yeah, go
what's the
ahead.
material difference between a signature and autograph? If I'm looking at a
S
piece of paper, how would I know which is a signature and which is an autograph?
well, read the small print. It'll say
Okay.
signature or signing. And if it doesn't say, then you should write on that thing autograph. That
Okay.
means in your capacity as a man or woman, you're coming lawfully. Now, if you want to go into a commercial contract, by all means, sign that as legal chattel, as where you're recognizing yourself as as surety. That's all legal stuff, though. So most people, even when they're signing mortgages, they're signing whatever. They don't maybe understand the difference between an autograph and a signature, or lawful versus legal. For instance, a lawyer is lawful. An attorney is legal. They're at
Mm.
law. When you
Mm.
sign lawfully, you sign with an autograph or a thumbprint. When you sign legally, you use your signature, which is connected to your all caps name, your social security number. Now, if the tax authority, the IRS sees you as an individual taxpayer and you sign, contracts with the IRS, you're consenting to that characterization of yourself. Most people, how many times have you gotten a new phone and you just flip through the quick small print and you hit agree? Well, what did you just agree to? It's a big deal. It's a contract. And so is that a mistake? I think so. It's definitely a mistake. So in equity, um, there's equitable remedy for a mutual mistake. And this mutual mistake happens all the time. The real estate person, they don't know that they don't know the jurisdiction very often. They're just doing things they've been taught to do. The person at the DMV, the person at the recording, the clerk's office at the Superior Court, they're they're doing what they've been taught to do and what they're being paid to do and what they've been told to do. And the people who told them to do it were likely doing what they did based on customs. And so there's mutual mistakes happening all the time. We find it all the time. Judges make mistakes, attorneys make mistakes. Obviously, people make mistakes. So one of the equitable maxims is, and I can't think of a full thing off the top of my head, but it's effectively that equity will aid effectively a mutual mistake, or it will render it neutralized effectively.
Hmm.
So if you are a used car salesman and you sell someone a car and you don't realize that you're asking them to sign something and that you're in a commercial jurisdiction and you didn't know that, then you've made a mistake. And the person purchasing is now making a mistake as well. Most of the time, there's a mistake involved in almost everything we've done commercially.
Hmm.
So it is a commercial honor to utilize and to rescission when a mistake has been found out. And of course, under force or duress, of course, that contract is null and void as well. You can't, coercion cannot be an element of your contract. So those are both recognized under these equitable maxims and even in common law to be seen as, there's remedy for these sorts of situations. And so
Hmm.
when you rescission, now you want to do everything you can to be an honor. If you did go and sign for a mortgage and you read all the fine print, you know, you you need to think about that. Sacred honor would state that if you put yourself into a position with full consideration, then you need to honor that agreement.
Hmm.
So this is not just a relief valve for any Tom, Dick, or Harry to go do whatever they want to. You shouldn't just say, "Oh, I made mistakes." I made a mistake back when I was 10. I'm going to rescission all contracts from there out. That's not what I'm saying here. What I'm saying here is to be honorable with with yourself and with the others around you, and
Hmm.
recognize when there's been an actual mistake and fix it.
Hmm.
You can fix it. There's remedy there.
One of the things that we've learned how to do is to discharge taxes. Can you walk us through the accounting of that and why that is possible?
Well, in you everyone's aware of the term consent. In equity, we use assent and we inquire. So one of the ways, some of the notices that we send, I'm a huge proponent of non-negotiable inquiry notices. And our combined, our teacher taught me a great deal about this, Andrew, um, writing these notices of inquiry to first understand, why am I getting this bill? Why am I being taxed, et cetera, et cetera. And you can ask questions till the cows come home. It never rises or escalates to a point of, being charged with anything. It's totally within your equitable right to ask questions. That's what inquiry is. Inquiry helps you understand the lay of the land, as it were, to understand intentions and to bring about more information that's vital to your case. So you might start with the IRS by sending non-negotiable inquiry notices, and you can ask as many as you want, and you'll just continue to get more information from them, because if you're, 40, 50 years old and you've been around a while, chances are the IRS has a lot of information connecting you to taxation. So they'll start sending you multiples of, letters and notices to that end, giving you information. Okay. So from there, we all understand the term consent. Well, in equity, we use that term that I mentioned, assent. Um, when you accept, upon acceptance, which is a commercial term, um, when you accept something, and I'm going to kind of go at this like a sacred honor way as well. In sacred honor, you accept the gifts of God. You return to God that which you don't understand or cannot change, and you give that up. And that is an assent. That information, that line of connectivity is an assent. When we consent to a contract or demand from, say, the IRS or anybody like that, we're consciously consenting to certain obligations. When you accept by assent, you're you're accepting that which you cannot change, but you're not consenting. And believe it or not, these are commercial terms as well. So there is a spiritual factor in all of this.
Mm-hmm.
So, but when you accept and return presentments from the IRS, effectively you are, in my opinion, and I think it's that of Andrew, you are settling, you're helping to settle a national debt. You're balancing the books. You are returning by assent, and you're accepting their offer. It's a presentment, it's an offer to settle, and you have a duty and a power. So when you return by assent, they don't always know what exactly uh, you're returning. And sometimes there's some confusion there, because remember, they don't always understand the law, or maybe even their own law. But IRS is very is been pretty amazing at discharging debt when it's done properly. When you accept and return with proper notice, and we could get into the mechanics of that. I think that's a better class for Andrew. But when you get into the mechanics of sending these inquiry notices along with acceptance notices and returning by assent, you are accepting their offers and you're returning it back to them, that you acknowledge it, but you have an equitable remedy for either rescission, mistake. Was this, was there a mistake on the part of the IRS? Was the accounting wrong? Was there coercion? Okay. So you open up this conversation with the notices of inquiry, and then you begin to close and discharge the matter through this process of acceptance and returning. Um, and again, there's more mechanics there to this, but effectively, that's a very easy process, and they understand that because your energy, that you were born commercially and insured and bonded, so you have a commercial value immediately. So your signature, and I'm saying signature, is very valuable. So when you accept and return, everyone's like, well, what are you returning? Well, you're returning with your signature. You're returning that earlier signature that you put on a piece of paper or whatever. You're returning it back to them, and you want to settle and close the account. And they're using the value from your good name to go to the Fed window and discharge that debt because it was fictitious anyways. So, I mean, this really goes down a rabbit hole, but if you wanted to, if you uncover a gold piece from 1920, what's changed? Nothing. It's still the same. It's all of its intrinsic characteristics are intact. It weighs
Hmm.
the same. But why is it not worth the $20 that it once was? Well, it's worth probably closer to 8,000 now. So you got to ask yourself, why? Why did that happen? How does that happen? It's not because anything with the gold piece changed. It's the devaluing of the dollar. And if
Hmm.
gold is was the gold standard and now you can, gold is, I don't know, do some quick math. If gold is really suppressed, even though it's selling on the market for around 4,000, it's probably worth double that. It's probably close to 8,000. Okay, so what's the real value of that gold piece now is, $7,980 positive to the dollar.
Hmm.
So the dollar's that much negative. What I'm getting at is those FRNs are a negative debt instrument. It's a note. And that is backed by your blood, sweat, and tears and your social security number, all of us. So your signature is so powerful when you use that properly to accept and return presentments from most of the three-letter agencies. That's how you slowly work out discharge. Discharge is what you want in the commercial world. You want to be discharged. When you come off of a boat after sailing the seas for many years, you're discharged. When you come out of the military, you're discharged.
Interesting. More water terms. So the
Yeah,
way if for anybody who's listening to this and was like, that was essentially another language, I had no idea what you were talking about. Again,
sorry.
patience, because no, because I've been doing this now for a few years, and I'm still fuzzy on some of this stuff. I've even done it, and I'm still fuzzy on some of this stuff. So, again, if you're listening to this, bear with us. Here's how I've explained it, because my mind is certainly not as uh, intricate and well versed as yours. So I have to break it down to really dumb level. Here's how I explain it, and you tell me if this is essentially right or if there's something fundamentally that I got wrong on it. It's my understanding that the FRNs, Federal Reserve notes, what most people would call as dollars or money, is lent into the system by central banking. That so when we walk around and we hold money, we think we're holding a positive value of something, when in fact we're really holding a piece of paper that says you owe this back to the central bank. That we're all collectively holding these debt instruments. Where did those debt instruments come from? They came from essentially our consent. We used our signatures to say, I want to borrow this money from you, central banker. Therefore, I'm charging the system. I'm charging the environment with more dollars, more Federal Reserve notes. And if I can use my signature to bring that into existence, therefore I can use my signature to take it out of existence and say, okay, I'm done with this. I'm discharging it. Take it now out of the system. Is that accurate?
I would say so. I think I followed that pretty closely, but yeah, there might have been a word or two that you might want to use differently there, but effectively, yes, it is a debt instrument, and you're right that when we're using our signature, we're 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 putting that money back out there. So when we accept and return, we're no longer controlling that debt note anymore. We want to give the debt notes back. As we do that, in my opinion, it's balancing the national debt, as Andrew would say. And so, yes, effectively, what you're saying is correct.
That's what I'm
And it
getting
all
at.
happens because you and I have value. It's
Right.
based on our individual value. We are the money, or we
Right.
are the currency, at least.
Can you explain briefly the history of that, how that came to be? Because we went from a gold standard where in the Constitution it says that only gold and silver will be used as legal tender, I believe. But then they confiscated the gold. And so therefore
Hmm.
they at the time historically when I learned this stuff in school, it was like, oh, they took the gold, but they gave us pieces of paper. If they took $10,000 worth of gold, they gave you $10,000 worth of paper. And so it was a like exchange. But the more I started to understand this, it was not a like exchange because the one, i.e., gold, silver, has intrinsic value, whereas a piece of paper has only fictitious value. It has value because the king said so, or in this case, our federal government. So, and not only did they take the gold and silver, but they actually took away our future ability to lawfully pay for things. So, there needed to be an equitable remedy that we don't get taught about, that's often hidden or convoluted and confusing. And that equitable remedy is to discharge. Again, I'm sharing with you what my current understanding is, and maybe I completely got this wrong. But historically, it's my understanding that they confiscated the gold, therefore they confiscated our ability to actually lawfully pay for anything. And they said, "Here, take this money instead of you pay for it." Well, fundamentally, we're now not actually lawfully paying for goods and services because we're not actually using the thing that our Constitution said that we should be using, and therefore, uh, we have an equitable remedy by discharging, by using that same signature that brought that Federal Reserve notes into existence. We could use our signature to then take them out of existence, thereby discharging, and that was our equitable remedy because we don't actually have the gold and silver to do it the right way. Is that reasonable? Is that fair? Is that
Yeah.
an accurate statement?
I,
Okay.
no, I think that's totally accurate. I think you're spot on.
So when somebody discharges their taxes and they accept in return the presentment given to them by the IRS, uh, is there an accounting? You said that it goes to the Federal Reserve window. Is there an accounting where they say, okay, here's your $10,000 acceptance. We're now going to take $10,000 of FRNs out of the system? Is that actually what's going on, or are they taking money
Well, I
from a trust or what?
Well, it depends. There's a number of different centers, so you can they may have to. It may take them some time to do some back shop understanding of when you were taxed, what it was, what it was allocated for over what year, what time, all these things. So there could, depending on how complex your footprint has been, um, in with the IRS, it may take them some time to balance their books on the other side. Now, there is this is outside of my my realm of research a little bit, but there has been massive amounts of fractional banking going on with everybody's names in every direction. Is the IRS directly involved with that? I'm not certain. I don't know. That's not information I'm privy to, but they certainly do seem to take quite some time to balance their books on their end and bring everything back into the black. And I'm assuming from what I can tell that you're balancing against money that has been lent or utilized somewhere else. Those your fictional person, that social security number individual, has been utilizing debt instruments. And as you have paid into things using that debt instrument, they're basically leaning your name. Um, and so when you discharge and return, I think they're balancing those books. Now, is there fractional banking
Mhm.
going on there with the IRS? I'm not 100% certain about that. I don't have any reason to believe that is the case. Certainly it is the case with the banks, credit cards. Most financial institutions are doing that. And there's a couple of people I know who could answer that straight away. But Andrew certainly would be able to shed light on that particular question. But I believe that is they are balancing their books because those FRNs were going somewhere and they're circulating in the system. To what
Hmm.
extent and where exactly, I'm not certain. But there is this process of when I've seen it with some people take as many as 5 to 7 years to finally have their matter resolved, where it's either been totally discharged or the claim is now quieted. Nothing, no, there's no continuation of knocks at the door or notices in the mail. Um, so I think they are balancing the books at the Fed window as you return those debt instruments, as you stated.
Okay. Um, when you're discharging, is that a equitable remedy or is that a commercial remedy with equitable principle?
Oh, I believe it's 100% commercial.
Yeah. Okay,
So
good.
read Lincoln Levine's discharge and charge. Those come straight out of the Mar Admiralty Maritime, you know, language.
Well,
That's what
what's the
that
name of the
is.
book?
Lincoln Levine's Manual on Commercial Law. Where is it?
Okay. So that's what I, okay,
You
sweet.
can't really see it. Lincoln Levine's Manual on Commercial Law. But the um, when we're talking equity and again, I don't know if you've had Andrew on here or maybe you will, but
I have.
he has a spectacular process by which he he's very adept in compelling performance commercially. So um, when you use equitable remedy, you're seeking discharge, which is the commercial language. So, in other words, where we spoke about the Confederation of States, that's lawful. The Confederation of States was lawful language in law, whereas the federal government would speak in terms of commerce or commercial law.
Hmm.
And if you're a ship out to sea, what do? You don't accuse someone, you charge them or you discharge them. You don't
Hmm.
have time for mutiny on the high seas. So you're going to take care of an issue really quickly. You're going to directly charge them like they do on the side of the road now. But that comes from being on ships. You're charged and you're thrown in the brig. You don't have time to risk a mutiny and have the ship go down because everyone's fighting with rifles and cannons and whatnot on a ship, right?
Hmm.
So you are charged. So commercial Admiralty Maritime charge and discharge, those are commercial terms. Now you can use equitable remedy by compelling performance by way of using commercial language. They're not going to communicate to you. You walk in talking about the Constitution, and you walk in talking all this lawful stuff. Well, you're going to have a long row to hoe. They can't, you're talking Chinese to them. The
Hmm.
courts adjudicate everything at this time pretty much in commercially,
Hmm.
or federal rules of civil procedure, statutes and codes.
A lot
And
of people
so
don't.
if you, yeah, they don't
Uh,
understand. Yeah,
they don't know that the courts are actually commercial in nature. We've been taught that
right.
they're judicial and that they are weighing the the balance of right and wrong. And the reality is that they're commercial. So that shouldn't be something that hopefully doesn't anger you. It should be something that educates you, and then you start to
Enlightens
realize
you.
enlightens you,
Yes. Yeah.
ascends you, if you will.
Yeah,
And
or helps you to ascend, right?
yes, well, you know, it's interesting because when you start to learn that there are equitable, or I should say that there are even commercial remedies to compel performance, you realize, oh, this actually, this is a great system. Once you realize and understand how it actually works, um, you can achieve the outcome that you're seeking in a very you know,
Yeah.
efficient way. Um, can you explain?
You
Yeah,
go
go ahead.
ahead.
Finish this thought there
Oh
because I
no,
can
I was
get to a
just
little
going
bit.
to say well, I was just going to say that you can compel performance in any jurisdiction, whether it's commercial, whether it's a jurisdiction of the air, trust law, whether it's jurisdiction of the land. So all jurisdictions, you can compel performance. So that's just an aspect of law, you know, at large. But what I was going at earlier about was that when you walk into a court and they're all being adjudicated in the commercial jurisdiction, you need to speak to them in the language or speak with them, carry on a conversation with them, bring forward um, your your defense or your if you're a plaintiff, whatever it may
Inquiry.
be, your yeah, inquiry. Well, if we're utilizing inquiry, I'm just saying at large, in general, in the commercial world, you're going to go into the court and you would be best to know commercial language and know that it is commercial language and how to use it and not even to compel performance, just so that they can actually hear you and recognize what you're saying, and not mess up their oath of office. They're the federal government. They're there for, in my opinion, commercial manners. And so if that's the case, then don't go in there talking to them about your lawful rights and lawful this and lawful that and constitutional this and constitutional that. They're going to probably call you, they're going to say you're involved in patriot warfare and you sound like a terrorist. So not a good road to go down. Now, if
Mm-hmm.
you want to start talking to them in commercial language that they can understand, they can clearly have a clear chosen language to speak to you on. From that point, you can then ask them compelling questions that compel them to give you that discharge that you seek.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a mind bender a little bit, but very often you're going to find that you need to stand lawfully, but you got to speak commercially, and you've got to ask questions with a mind of equity. You
Beautifully
know, it's
stated.
not it's not really for the faint of heart.
Yep. I call it a spiritual rite of passage because I've gone through some now, a few layers of this where, I'm either in court or I'm dealing with the IRS. And yeah, you have the pit in your stomach moments. But then when you have to really immerse yourself in this and really reflect on it and understand the spirit behind it, the lawful foundations of it. But you said that so perfectly. Stand lawfully, speak commercially, and achieve, yeah, your equitable outcome that you're seeking. Can I ask you, are you good on time?
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, I'm good.
I'm still fuzzy on the whole surety. Uh, like I don't get it. I don't get it. What can you expand that out and explain what we're sureties of, what that even means in layman's terms?
Well, it's about, bonds, really. You're bonded. It's a surety bond, you know, at birth. So you're insured and then you're bonded. And you're bonded. So you're when you're born, you're insured for if you were born, I think it was after, say,
I think it was
I don't remember,
76.
77 or 76. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's what I'm gonna say. You were going to be insured for, I think, 1 million, and then you'd be bonded for another 1 million. And that number could have changed a little bit now with the latest generation. I'm sure it has because deficit keeps going sky high. So, but you're now bonded. So if you understand um, surety bonds, like in criminal cases, right? You get bail bondsmen, and what do they do? Bail, bounty hunters, right? They go out and
Hmm.
they hunt down someone who has a bond. There's, they took off from the court. They ran away, or they sent these bounty hunters out to go retrieve them. How are they doing? It's because you're connected by your contracts from the time from the time you started using that social security number and your driver's license. Most of us around 16, you started using your signature to sign contracts, and it just starts stacking up from there. And you get CUSIP numbers, right?
Hmm.
And I think this is one of the ways that you and I kind of met. I shared with you some information to find your CUSIP number out there.
Hmm.
But anyway, you start getting checks and um, balances, or negative and positive marks against your good name after the time you're born, and you start working around in the commercial jurisdiction. So your bond either goes up or it goes down depending on your actions throughout life. And so they'll pull that surety bond forward. And the only way that's able to happen is because of all the times you've used your wet signature to sign contracts, effectively acting like a beneficiary, acting like a trustee. So there's sort of a breach of trust occurring from the age of about 16. So you have all this negative, you have some positives. You graduate high school, you get a degree in college, you get honorable discharge from the military, you're married and you don't have any divorces, different things like this. Your bond will have more value, and it gains value over time. So um, you because we're connected to the IMF and International Monetary Fund and the Social Security Administration, we are connected to that originating bond that was put on us when we were not necessarily put on us, but a bond
Was
was
created.
created.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so when we get a little too far afield, left or right, they can pull us back in by way of that bond. So that's what makes us the surety. It's because we're literally connected to surety bond at birth. So, like, imagine it this way: you're a rancher and you've got cattle, and every head of cattle is worth, I don't know, $3,000 or whatever. And you know, the cattle walks out, breaks the fence, and your neighbor down the road stops and picks them up and brings them back to the ranch, right?
Hmm.
Or worse off, it roams, but it's still on your property and gets hit by a semi. Well, technically, if it's a free range area, they'll need to pay you for the death of that cow.
Hmm.
It's your money. That was your, it's a little different there, but you effectively, because you own that animal and it has value, it's to be paid out back to you.
Hmm.
So for me and for you, if we're pulled in as surety, it's because you're bonded. You've been bonded at birth, and they effectively own us by our consent that we've expressly written out onto contracts, either devaluing or upping the value of our bond. So that's what they're referring to when you're being called surety. It connects you back to that original surety bond that was generated at your birth.
Mm. Okay. Um, can you give us a glimpse into your services around the personal finance? Sorry, the private financing. Um, give us a before and after where somebody might find themselves too exposed, and and then what does the after look like once they're in private banking that you assist them with?
Well, first of all, there's okay. It depends. Everybody's unique in how much money they have, how many contracts they have out there. But let's just try to pick a middle of the road situation. Somebody has sold a house and it's their only house, and so they don't want to, they don't owe any capital gains on it because it's their primary residence, and they don't. feel good about leaving their money in the bank because they don't trust the bank. They see that they're only insured, FDIC is only going to insure them for so much, and they've got more than that amount being held in an account or a few accounts. So um, I work with Liberty Dollar Financial Association, and they will hold you know, your Federal Reserve notes in silver. They don't require Social Security number. They don't require an EIN, none of this stuff. So what does that mean? And well, I think it means number one, you're storing your dollars in silver, which you can do at a million different places, but they don't, the only ones I know of that offer the financial services are LDFA.
Hmm.
And so what that looks like is that while you're holding your Federal Reserve notes, which are rapidly declining and don't have any value, they're fiat currency, you're holding it in industrial silver, which is on a nice steady climb right now,
Hmm.
worth about at least, about 37 and climbing, maybe 38 by now, dollars an ounce. And that market's being suppressed too. Um, so that part is pretty basic. Anybody can store their Federal Reserve notes in bullion or gold. It can be stored in a vault. Um, LDFA has not doesn't have very crazy vaulting fees. They're very reasonable, but they offer financial services such as e-checks to help you, pay contractors, pay mortgages, pay if you got utility bills, whatever. You've got these sort of financials, this financial association component of Liberty Dollar that's next level. You can use digital wallets. You can use PayPal card, Venmo cards. You can use different quasi-private ways of moving cash and utilizing different debit cards for the sake of convenience. And it's untouchable as it's stored in silver. It's not legal tender. So it's totally off limits to IRS or whoever. Now, there's a lot more to that, and there's a number of nuances. Like you might want to use a different card for depositing money at an ATM. But if you want to just not use any cards whatsoever, you can always send cashier's checks. You can send money orders. There's many different ways to physically send money to LDFA, and they will hold that silver for you. They will send you the certificates if you want those, which are really nice certificates, by the way. And they spend just like money because they are backed directly by the silver they hold. Or they will send you the silver coin if you want to put it in your own safe, whatever. So, um, but what is next level about them is that they will, if you got a monthly rent check, they'll disperse that rent check, on time. You can set it up, automatic withdrawal. And so they've got these. They're not a bank. They're a financial association, and they work with a mint. That mint is bonded, and they do work with a partner bank for doing wire transfers. You can do international transfers just like you would with any other bank, but they themselves are an association and they just offer bank-like services. But when you deposit, you're purchasing silver, and when you withdraw, you're selling silver. But again, I think you are hedging bets against the collapsing dollar by
Hmm.
holding it in silver. And their fees are very, very low. It's if you have a decent deposit, you can get your minting fee down to about $1 an ounce, which is not that much. So and when you consider the opportunity cost of holding that value in silver as silver climbs, it's actually it's an investment strategy as well as quite useful and practical everyday use of private movement of your funds.
Hmm.
You can link up commercial banks to it. You can link up other commercial credit or debit cards, whatever you want to do. But the option is there for you to be, you know, as secure and as private as you're going to get in 2025 in the financial world.
Hmm.
So to me, it's next level, and it's really the only place that you can manage to do this and be purely private.
Hmm. So the thing that makes it private essentially is that there's your social security is not really attached to all this stuff. So you can have the same services, but because it's being fundamentally transacted in silver, there's no tracking of it. There's no social security attached to it, thereby making it private. Just want to
Correct. And
help.
and when you do set up an account, it's effectively a trust account. It's immediately set up as a trust. So um, and you are a member of the private association. So it's member to member services. You're not necessarily purchasing, you're honoring them for their services as a member. So
Mm-hmm.
and that's a major linguistic component of private entities is that if you're going to be part of a congregation, then you're naturally a spiritually discerned man or woman, and you are engaging in private endeavors with other members of your congregation or your
Mm.
association. Um, and so you're not using commercial processes to do all of this. You're using private, lawful processes.
Makes sense. Um, Nash, we have covered a lot of ground here. I think this might be a good place to tie up this conversation. But I would absolutely love to have you back on and maybe not try to bite off so much and get narrow in on any one of these things and kind of go deeper with it. It's
I
such
know
a
I
it's hard because I know my audience is not this isn't necessarily the world. I'm trying to introduce it to them. So on the one hand, I want to give a broad overview. On the other hand, I know some of us have gone a little bit deeper and your wisdom goes very deep. So I want to take advantage of that and share that as well. So hopefully we've done a good job here of giving both a little bit of a broad understanding historically of how this stuff has come to be, as well as gone a little bit deeper with some of these things to give. If you got to a point, if you're listening to this and you got to a point where you're like, I have no idea what you guys are talking about, I think we've done a little bit of a service to help you realize that there's another world out there that is um, can provide a lot of benefit to you, but hopefully folks have been able to stay on this because I know it's at least for me it's been a difficult thing. It's learning a new language. You really are learning a whole new language. So it can be a little bit difficult. But anyway, thank you so much
it
for
it
sharing
is.
all this. It's been
Yeah.
awesome. What any tie up thoughts that you have that you want to share with folks that are listening and might be interested in learning more about this kind of thing?
Um, you can go to CrowsFoot.Info. That's my channel. And again, we offer trustee services. We write trusts and private entities. Um, I do teach an immersive class in trust law and writing private entities and contracts. If you'd like to know more there, that's where you would find out. You can email me and find all my contact information there at CrowsFoot.Info. Um, the only thing I would say at the end here is just that your your private pathway is unique to you, and it's not a one size fits all. So we use equity, trust law, and common law to help navigate to where that private world is for you at this time. So that's what I do, and yeah, come and see us at CrowsFoot.info, I guess.
Yeah. Very good, man. Well, thank
Yeah.
you again for sharing your wisdom. I'm very honored to have you on. This has been an awesome conversation. Hope to do it again sometime soon.
I appreciate it. Hopefully, there's not too much to edit here. Thanks
Yeah.
again.
Yeah. All right. Take care.